Rappin with ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
Hey, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer. So on today's live stream, I welcome back Dr. Eli Meyer from AquaBiomics. What's up there, Eli? And a new guest, Dr. Andy Bouwma, who is a science educator and hobbyist. What's going on there, Andy?
How you doing, Keith?
Good to have you on, man. We actually met. We met in person at MACNA, wasn't it? That was where we met in person. But you're a big viewer of the live stream and a power user of Eli's service. So really psyched to have both of you guys on together. Just some more background on these guys. Eli is a coral biologist and aquarium hobbyist, and he owns AquaBiomics. AquaBiomics can analyze the microbiome of an aquarium using DNA sequencing, so they can diagnose issues and identify strategies for promoting a healthy microbiome. Besides being a frequent viewer of this live stream, thank you, Andy. Andy has a Ph.D. in zoology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has published research on tropical ecology and science education. For the last 15 years, Andy has focused on teaching a variety of university courses in biology and conservation. Andy has kept aquariums for his whole life, but started focusing on saltwater about 11 years ago. Andy currently maintains several systems with a focus on Acropora and Goniopora. So before we start chatting with these guys, I want to thank the sponsors of the live stream, both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine. I really appreciate these companies supporting the show, and I also appreciate all you folks out there tuning in. I see there's a whole bunch of people out there in the chat. Hello, hello. And as per usual, we encourage questions, comments, and yeah, I want to make this as interactive as possible. We do have a bit of an agenda for the show tonight, but would love to see if anybody has any interesting comments and questions out there in the chat, and I will do my best to get to all that stuff. Yes, Great Bearded Reef Paul. Make sure to smash that like button and share the video, yes, so more people can find this live stream. So Eli, man, we've had you on the live stream, a couple of times in the past, and I know there's some new stuff going on with AquaBiomics. Did you want to kind of kick things off and give everybody an update on what's new with the service?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for the chance. It's always great to talk with you guys. So yeah, I wanted to start by talking about some of the new information that we're including in the reports. Anybody out there who has been a client of ours for a while may remember that in the early days of the service, I would painstakingly type out sometimes very long emails trying to explain to you what your results meant. And over time, it became both way too labor intensive, and it also just took too long. So it was like you were waiting too long to get that extra information. So what I've done now over the last say 6 months or so, I've built a lot of that information into the website. So now you're getting, when you get your report back, you're getting a custom that will say things like, you have this parasite, here's a link to some more information. You have too many dinoflagellates, here's a link to some information. And I thought we might take a look at this. Keith, did you have a screen grab of that tank DNA test? Let's see if it works. If not, we'll just do it
I got the parasites. Yep.
Perfect. That's the one. So, we generally on this show have focused on the microbiome test. That is a DNA analysis of the bacterial community in your tank. But DNA is DNA. And so we can use DNA testing to look at other communities. We use it to look at communities, including parasites. And so we're going to show here an image from a tank DNA test report. I've anonymized it. I've taken out the identifying information. Just wanted to be able to point at this thing and show you some of this additional information that's included.
Yep.
What's that? Is it showing up?
Yeah, it's there. I've had it up. Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay. So I guess I don't see it, but I can talk through this. So this particular test report.
Yeah, you're not going to see it unless you're watching us on YouTube. You're not going to see it.
That's fine. Let me just pull this up, because of course I sent you the files, so I do have it. Sorry about that. I'm tech savvy when it comes to DNA sequencing, and terribly tech illiterate with a lot of Zoom and Skype and that sort of thing. Okay, so yeah, I'm looking here at the parasites table from this test report. And what I wanted to point out to you is that I've added some important information here on the levels and the prevalence of these parasites. So Keith and Andy, are you guys seeing this? The Uranema and Cryptocaryon, and you can see the levels.
I can see it. If you guys are not watching on YouTube, you can't see it. But
okay, fine.
I can't see it.
So trust me, it's there.
Okay,
it's
so
there.
Let's focus in on ick here, because this is the topic of a lot of discussion. So this particular sample that I've just stripped away the ID from, so you don't know who it is. This particular sample had a low level of ick, and I thought it might be worth pointing out of information that you can extract from the report. First, let's take a look at the levels themselves. Okay, the absolute level, 0.1% of the DNA in this sample came from ick. Now that's a pretty low level. That's on the very low end of the range. That means we probably found 10 or more individual DNA sequences, each of which perfectly matched ick. So I'm confident it was in the sample. It's too high to be some kind of a false positive, but it's really low. Look at that percentile, right? It's only the 37th percentile. So most tanks that have ick have higher levels than this tank does.
Gotcha.
And the prevalence number over on the right, you see that as of the time that this report was generated, 13% of the tanks that we've tested have ick. So stepping back from this, yes, this tank has ick, but it has it at a very low level. It shares that in common with about 13% of the other tanks out there. And the level in this tank is lower than most of the tanks that we've ever found ick in. The other thing I want to point out here, now in the old days, if you got ick in your test report, I would painfully type out a whole bunch of paragraphs about that. And, it took a lot of time, but even worse, I would often forget to include some details, right? It's a lot of stuff to type manually. Well, now, if you were to click on that marine ick link, it would take you to a web page on the AquaBiomics website with a whole bunch of details about ick, including links to other resources, including links to treatment options for ick. So all of that information really is now right in your report without having to wait for me to get around to write the email to you.
There you go.
So that's what I wanted to show you, is this general philosophy. We're trying to move everything into the reports so that you get it more quickly, because I can produce these reports through an automated process. And so within 24 hours of getting the data back from the center, I can have that in your account.
So this has got nothing to do in terms of your, well, maybe it does have something to do in terms of the new functionality of the reports, or the more granularity. But marine ick, you said 13% of the tanks you test, reef tanks, I'm assuming. Well, maybe there are some fish only tanks in that sample or whatnot. But
right, and I don't subdivide it. It's just all tanks. That number.
And I saw Bobby Miller was on the live stream Humblefish, and I'm sure I asked him this question. But in terms of ick, Eli, what's the best treatment plan if you got a reef tank and you got some visible ick on the fish there, and your tests confirm that? What's a non-invasive treatment for a reef tank for ick?
Yeah, so I'm defer here to other resources. Honestly, I go to the Humblefish forum, and I link people to the Humblefish
Bobby,
forum.
you need to answer in the chat.
I'll make a couple of statements here. One is, I don't want to give advice about what to do with their tank. Institute's veterinary advice, and there are people with opinions about the regulation. So I'd like to stay out of giving official to add to your tank. Instead, I'd like to view it as an experiment. We're all conducting experiments on our tanks, and I can give you resources. I can link to the resources from the experts in fish disease and fish handling, and that's what I try to do. I haven't done experiments on how best to clear ick from a tank, and so I don't want to present some opinion that I don't have data.
All right, so you heard that, folks. No questions about how to handle RTN, STN, how to treat that stuff. Go ahead, Andy.
Can I ask a question to Eli?
Go ahead. Let me follow up on what Keith just said. I'm happy to answer questions about that stuff, but I do want to put that. Maybe it seems like a silly technical caveat, but I want to put that caveat out there. I am not giving you advice about what to put in your tank. I'll share, information that you can use to decide what to do to your tank. But
so
I don't want people
scenario
when they're expensive fish or coral dyes.
Question that came up today, right? So somebody gets a very low value for ick.
Yeah.
I think 0.03. Was the value, right?
Yeah.
It's in the 13th percentile of the tanks you've tested. That person has not observed any fish health issues.
Yeah.
Any idea what's going on there? I mean, you're confident that the signal is real. Yeah. It's not contamination. There is ick in the tank. What's it doing? Any idea?
So let's. You said a few things, and let's hit on a few of them. Okay. One is this finding of low levels of ick. This is a reasonably new thing. The test has become more sensitive. I know we've discussed this amongst ourselves, but I think we haven't done it on the live stream yet. Starting early this year, I introduced an improvement in the lab process for all of our tests. It's just an additional cleanup. The reason for this was to improve sequencing yield, and it did that. It improved sequencing yield. We get more data back, and we get less variation in yield. It also had the pleasant surprise of making the tank DNA test more sensitive than it was before. Now, this wasn't immediately apparent. It's not like we get the first results back and say, everything's different. We had to get a few batches back and say, we're seeing it, and we're seeing it at a lower level than we used to. So we're finding ick now at low levels like 0.03 or 0.01%. So we're finding it in more tanks than we used to. We're finding it at lower levels. It's all consistent with the test has got. Also could be contamination. And that was the first thing I was like, oh crap, something went wrong, right? But there's a few ways you can think about contamination. Assessing a bunch of samples at once, if it was just sort of mixed into one of our common reagents, you'd expect to find it in all of them at comparable levels. And it's never like that. We never find it in all the samples. Importantly, we never find it in the negative controls, right? So again, that doesn't look like contamination. We also don't find it in samples that were next to each other within the little plates that we use. That might indicate cross-contamination. That's not how it shows up. It just looks like we're really seeing truly ick in tanks that we previously, or in a higher frequency of tanks than we used to. Ick's not the only thing though, right? If it was just ick, you'd say, well, there's something wrong with the test. But no, we're seeing more of everything. So our overall diversity in tank DNA has increased by 2 to 4-fold. We're seeing more aptasia than we used to. And I don't think there's more aptasia in your tanks. I think everybody, or a lot of people, had aptasia. And the test was previously not as sensitive for it as it is now. Okay, so all of that is just to put a little detail under the statement that I believe this is real, these observations of higher prevalence levels. So what's it doing? You know, how could it be in a tank and not causing disease? Well, I think here we're talking about a in reef keeping as long as reef keeping has been around, right? I think people have long suspected that ick. I've read the statement on forums, ick stinks. Our data don't support that. Our data don't support that ick is in, but they do support the idea that tanks that don't have visible fish diseases ongoing sometimes have known. It's the case with ick, but it's the case with some other parasites too. We've found tanks with Uranema in them, Uranema marinum, the one that is, you know, very clearly associated with disease. And it sometimes shows up in tanks that have known infections going on. This bizarre myxozoan parasite that I think, Keith, we might have found in your tank at one point. Anyway, it showed up in a handful of tanks. You know, this is a known parasite of butterfly fishes and other fishes that we keep in the hobby. But we frequently find that without active parasite infections. So, I mean, broadly, I think what's going on here is some of these parasites can exist without feeding on a fish, like Uranema, right? Others exist in stages that stage isn't actively infecting a fish, right? And you can have resistance in the tank, right? The fish can become resistant. And I mean, I'm waiting that people have talked about on the forums here for decades, because I don't have really new information to share on that. I think that all of those are, you know, explanations for what we're seeing. But what we're seeing is that tanks that don't have an active known fish infection can have detectable and convincing levels of some fish parasites.
Interesting. So Bobby commented in terms of the possible treatment. He said that possible in-tank peroxide dosing, but it needs more testing for eliminating marine ick. Alex Correa is saying to treat ick, we can just remove all the fish for about 60 days from the tank and treat them with copper. That is the only true solution besides not reducing the parasite. Yeah, you know, I mean, that's a tough one if you've got an established reef tank.
Right. There's a lot of approaches out there, right?
So, Eli, you mentioned that you know, there was a statement people were wondering about in terms of, is ick present in every reef tank? What about coral pathogens? You know, is there some level of coral pathogens in everybody's reef tank? You know, are your tests able to pick up even the smallest percentages of you know, coral pathogens in a tank? Or go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we can extend it to that group too. So no, I absolutely see reef tank samples that have very nice microbiomes, lots of data, you know, very deep sampling, and we don't find a single known coral pathogen in them. So I definitely would not make the statement that coral pathogens are in every tank. At least we don't have data are in every tank. Similar to what we were just discussing about fish parasites, you know, we do we do find low levels of coral pathogens in some tanks where people say, no, my corals are healthy. It's a challenging game we're playing here. You know, everybody's keeping different corals, has a dozen different parameters that differ among their tanks, and we're trying to generalize, you know, things like how much is too much for a particular coral pathogen. Well, it may very well depend on a lot of things, like what kinds of corals you have.
So, you know, Andy, you and I have been going back and forth on this. I know you've done a lot of research in terms of the prevention of coral pathogens coming into a tank, right? You know, so how feasible is it to keep pathogens out of a tank if you're getting frags from somebody, or if you're getting, you know, some tank water from somebody with a fish in it? You know, can coral pathogens be transferred via the water? Obviously, I guess it can be transferred via corals, but is there an effective way to prevent them via dips? And what would that protocol look like? You know, I think that's probably more of a question for you, Andy, in terms of that protocol. But I guess also Eli, in terms of, I guess, my more macro questions in terms of, is it feasible to prevent, you know, parasites, coral pathogens from coming into a reef tank? You know, that.
Right. I mean, I think it's a goal that we should all be striving for, and I think we can achieve it to some extent, probably not perfectly. One thing I want to mention, based on what you just said, you were talking about the water. I want to just emphasize that we do separate our tests of the water and the biofilm, and so I can kind of speak to that and say the water does contain a lot of, you know, when we find coral pathogens, we find them in the water. That's the way I should say this. We don't find them in the swabs from the pipe. So if we're worried about transferring coral pathogens from one tank to another, we absolutely should be thinking about the water as a possible vector. There's good evidence for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I could add on to that, I think that I'm not sure I don't remember what Eli's prevalences are, but you know, there's a good 10% of tanks that have SETLD bacteria. There's less than that have Arcobacter. These are pathogens that we have fairly strong circumstantial evidence that they cause pathology in reef aquariums. And they absolutely can be transferred by water. We know that SETLD in the wild is spread in the water. And so how do you avoid that? That's a great question. So I've kind of gone around and around about this, but I think really the best way to address it is to have a quarantine system and do a lot of observations. And then if you bring in new corals that have issues that you see, you know, you'll have to treat them. And we'll talk about some things that I did to treat my own tank for bacterial issues. But you also have to, I think it's a little bit, it might be a little bit like aptasia in that it might just, it's so hard to keep it out of a display system that it's always going to sneak in somehow because it can be transferred in the water. I think we have to learn about how to manage a low level of these pathogens. And I'll just give one example of one thing that I've very much focused on in my own reef tank husbandry is being really careful about if pieces of acros get broken off. Like I have a naso tang that you'll see when you play the tank video that likes to swim into things and break and frag colonies. And so I have little bits of coral falling.
I'm showing the video now there, Andy.
And okay, yeah. Speaking of that naso, just to calm everybody down, I had some tang police commenting on my video because if I take the screen off of the tank, that fish just starts swimming around like that. Like normally he's just super mellow, and so I took the top of the tank off, the screen top off, and the tang is just going back and forth and back and forth, and it looks like he's pacing and not happy. And so I had tang police telling me to get that naso tang out of that
He's
tank.
just a little disturbed about the top being off, huh?
Yeah. But still remembers when I had to catch him and throw him in quarantine because of a velvet outbreak, probably. But anyway, you know, I was finding that there were all sorts of little bits of acros in my sand bed. And I very much believe that pathogens do really well in the sand bed. And I noticed that if I was to leave a frag in the sand bed and just let it be, I would notice it would STN or RTN. And that's giving that pathogen a place to thrive and presumably raising its levels in the water and possibly setting yourself up for it spreading to your other colonies in your tank. And so one of the things that I'm really careful with now, making sure, even though I think I probably have pathogens in the tank, is I'm very careful about keeping any sort of corals, preventing them from getting buried. I have Goniopora that if they get buried in the sand, sometimes I've seen that develops into brown jelly infections. And STN, often RTN, happens to little frags of acros in the sand. So keep that sand clean to keep those pathogen levels low is my new mantra.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe if we can generalize from that a bit, it's like you're working to minimize the amount of diseased coral tissue in the tank, right? If one little frag gets hit by the sand, you're removing it or rescuing it. And I mean, I do think that's an important management strategy for all of us to keep in mind with coral disease is the bacterial load matters, right? So if you have a big, fat, diseased colony in the tank, that's not doing any favors for the other guys in the tank. Whether you want to sacrifice the colony or move it to a hospital, minimizing the amount of diseased tissue in the tank seems like a very good strategy.
I mean, how problematic can a sand bed be if you're stirring that thing up? I was managing some cyano in my 187 gallon display. I had a little sand in there. So I was taking a power head, blowing it around, and I was blowing some cyano off the rocks, but I was also kind of getting onto the sand bed and all that stuff. And I kind of had some episodes where some corals were not looking happy, over those weeks when I was disturbing that sand bed. So, yeah, I mean, can you be stirring the pot, so to speak, and really kind of giving some of those pathogens more of a gateway to the corals if you disturb it too much?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the sand bed has a very different microbial community. We have data on that, and it's consistent with some of the changes that we'll talk about in Andy's tank. That is, the biofilms and sand beds have a really high Rhodobacteriaceae level. This is a group that includes the SCTLD pathogens. So if you're stirring up the sand bed, you're certainly increasing the levels of that family, the Rhodobacter family, in the water column, at least on some temporary basis, right, until they sort of settle back out. I don't have evidence to say that higher Rhodobacteriaceae definitely corresponds to a coral disease level. But what I just want to add is that people have long discussed the benefits or harm of stirring sand beds, right? I think this has been a long debate on the forums. And I guess I'm just trying to add that I agree very much with what you're saying. In addition to any nutrient effects you might have by stirring the sand bed, you're certainly disturbing the microbial community. Yeah.
So Andy, getting back to what we were talking about in terms of trying to prevent the spread of coral pathogens from one tank to the other, what can you share with us what you've been experimenting with in terms of protocols for dipping?
Well, we've used some antibiotics. And just let me say something about antibiotics first. I think of antibiotics as a tool it's a relatively extreme tool. I think that every reef keeper ought to have a fire extinguisher in their fish room. Okay, antibiotics are like a fire extinguisher. Okay, antibiotics are there to put out fires. And so, if you want to think about what's an appropriate way to use an antibiotic, think about how you'd use a fire extinguisher. Keith, would you prophylactically treat your walls in your fish room with a fire extinguisher to prevent fire? Probably not, yes. Right? Probably not. I wouldn't either. But I've got a fire extinguisher in my fish room, right? And so I think about antibiotics that same way. And so I have moved, I've gone through several different things, but I've moved to having a quarantine, like a first resting place for my new Gonies, because I'm really into Gonies, okay? And one of the things that Eli and I have discovered is that Arcobacter is at least correlated, likely the causative agent of brown jelly disease in Gonies, just like it is in Euphilia. And I don't want, go ahead.
And let me just real quick add to that. We're talking about one very particular type of Arcobacter, not identified to a species level.
Yep.
We just call it type 1103.
Arcobacter 1103.
Yeah. So I just want to be clear, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different Arcobacters out there in marine samples. So this is a very specific finding that it is reporting. Yep. It's the same one that is associated with brown jelly disease.
Yep. And the same one we found related to RTN and Millies too, which is something we found more recently. But anyway, so my thinking is now that I bring all my new Gonies to my to one of my frag systems, and then I observe them. And if I see any evidence, retracted tentacles over time, if I see any evidence of what I've come to recognize as pre-symptoms of brown jelly disease, then I do a dip where I will, I've switched now. I had used Cipro, but now I use oxalinic acid because it's an antibiotic not used in human medicine, so it's a little better approach for treating pets, I think. And so I do dips I do 3 dips every 2 days for 2 to 4 hours, depending on how much time I have. And that's very effective at preventing me from introducing brown jelly on a new piece of Goni into my display or into my sort of second tier frag system. So I know I do not prophylactically dip everything. I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't spray my wall with a fire extinguisher prophylactically. I don't prophylactically dip things that I get in, because I don't want to overuse these antibiotics and potentially, watch them lose their effectiveness.
And should we be concerned about back-to-back dips? Let's say, we end up dipping something with antibiotics to try to prevent some bad bacteria from getting in the systems, and then we want to also dip in potassium chloride to prevent acro-eating flatworms.
Actually, back-to-back is not a problem at all. No. These are easy, very easy on the animals. Yeah. I mean, that 2-hour dip with aeration, they do great with that. Potassium chloride is another really easy dip on the animals. That barely touches them.
Same experience, Annie, with potassium chloride. I find that to be extremely gentle and very effective in terms of blowing up those acro-eating flatworms. Let's get to a couple of questions from the viewers here. We've got a few of them. Alex Correa, in your experience, are the coral pathogens as bacteria normally related to relatively higher nutrients by percentage of tanks tested? Have you seen that, Eli?
That is a question I could answer, and I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. Our database does include that information, and I think we'd have sufficient power to answer that question in our database. So I guess I'm talking myself into saying I have no excuse for not having an answer for you. I think we have data to bring to bear on it. There is evidence in the literature for that idea, but I haven't seen it in our data yet. I will have to look at it.
There's also, Keith, if I could just jump in, there's some circumstantial evidence for that from the time series of my tank that we'll look at later.
Okay. I think, Eli, there's another question for you. Rob B's Reef. How many data points does Eli think we need before other scientists can start to use this testing to find actionable items?
I mean, I think we have actionable items now. I think the utility of these data, the practical applications of these data, will continue to grow over time. Right now, we can, scientists, whether they are research scientists. We have research scientist clients at universities and at public aquaria who use our service for that kind of thing. But also, I don't know, what's the citizen scientist maybe is the right way to say this. You know, hobbyists who are also conducting real experiments in their living rooms, very tightly controlled with good record keeping. You know, citizen scientists in the reef keeping hobby can use our service right now to get some actionable items. But I do want to acknowledge where the question's coming from. That sort of we're in the early, you know, I can't tell you the identity of every bacterium that's in your sample. And I certainly can't tell you a treatment for every pathogen out there. Frankly, we're still discovering pathogens in the world of coral microbiology. So I want to acknowledge where the question's coming from, that right now it's only a subset of the potential for where it will be in the future. But already we have actionable items. You know, we find just one example, this Archibacter that we've been talking about. It's present in somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think it's 10-ish% of tanks that we test. This thing is so tightly associated with coral disease. There's no doubt in my mind this is the causative agent of some coral diseases. There are published reports of other Archibacters causing coral diseases, so it's not crazy to speculate this. And we've seen this tested in just about every direction, this Archibacter association. And there's a treatment, including an in-tank treatment. And so there's just one good example where right now I think, you know, hobbyists or scientists who are studying coral diseases can use our data and get some actionable items out of it. As we learn more, the list of actionable items will only grow.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly gotten usable data from you, Eli, and I know Andy has as well in terms of the coral pathogens, because I had a lot of RTN and STN events going on in one of my display tanks, and so I did a pre-test with you guys, and it showed that I had a couple of, I think, Andy, you probably remember this in terms of what I had in there, but it was, I think it was Archibacter, right?
Archibacter and Shimia.
Right, and then I did the post after doing an oxalinic acid treatment, and the Archibacter was completely gone, and the Shimia was significantly reduced, I believe, but maybe I flip-flopped that.
Yep.
But,
5 times lower levels.
And you had similar results too, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, this is great. This is exactly what we need more of in the hobby, is replicated experiments like this. You know, often when people do these experiments, they're unable to replicate them themselves because it's pretty hard running one reef tank, let alone 2. And if you did run 2 reef tanks, they wouldn't be identical. So you wouldn't have a very nicely replicated design anyway. So I love these independently replicated, you know, different reef keepers, different states, different tanks, and we get a consistent result, at least a result in the same direction.
And let's also emphasize, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing to what Eli was saying. So thinking globally, our European friends do not have access to these antibiotics, right? And so because of that, I don't think that antibiotics like we have access to in North America for these kinds of issues in reef tanks, I don't think that's the long-term future of the reef keeping hobby. I think probiotics are the long-term future of the reef keeping hobby. And there's a lot of exciting research being done to save wild reefs using probiotics. In fact, Eli's been in contact with some of those folks. And wow, I mean, it's challenging to apply probiotics to wild reefs because of the scale. Not so challenging in a reef tank.
Yeah.
I think there's some really promising things in the future for probiotics.
Andy, can you explain a little bit more in detail for folks like myself in terms of that don't have a complete handle on what probiotics can do? What are we seeing there?
Well, I think Eli actually knows the story better than me, actually. But Montastria, which is a Caribbean coral, has been decimated by SETLD. And a former colleague of ours is on a team that developed a probiotic that they found a bacterium that was present in resistant colonies of Montastria. So colonies that live under SETLD. And so they were able to test a bunch of different substances and they found one that had antibacterial activity against the SETLD bacteria. They did an experiment and found that it reduced SETLD by like 66%. And now the challenge is in lab experiments, and now the challenge is scaling it up to save Montastria on wild reefs. And there's no reason why, as those things are being developed for all these different species that are being threatened by things like SETLD, that these bacteria can't be utilized for the reef aquarium hobby.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, one thing I was going to mention, and Andy, you already kind of alluded to it, and is that you know, we have to really be careful in terms of treating our tanks with antibiotics. You know, I think there's a lot of folks out there that are seeing these RTN and STN events, and just right away want to be able to medicate that tank to solve that problem. But we just don't know a lot about, you know, how much impact antibiotics, how often you put antibiotics into a tank. You know, can that create these resistant strains of bacteria where down the road antibiotics are not going to work if you just keep hitting the tank with more and more antibiotics? So I think that's other, you know, research that would be great to have to kind of know what those limitations are and exactly at what point should you be, you know, taking that drastic step of using antibiotics on a tank.
Yeah, I mean, that's why you don't do it. You don't use them prophylactically.
Right.
The key is to not use antibiotics repeatedly on the same system. That is a recipe for disaster. I hear some people talk about using chemiclean like every 3 months. Chemiclean is erythromycin. You're doing that to your tank every 3 months. That's not a good idea. That's exactly what you don't want to do.
Yeah, and you know, in addition to these very real concerns about antibiotic resistance, both for the tank and for us, because of course antibiotic resistance can be transferred around from one bacterium to another. But in addition to all of that, there is also just the unintended consequences on the rest of the microbiome. You know, presumably, if you're listening to this podcast, you're YouTube, sorry, whatever we call it.
It's both.
If you're watching right now,
it's both.
It's all of these, all of the above, Eli.
You presumably believe that bacteria matter at some level in the aquarium, right? Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be listening. Well, when you hit your tank with a big dose of antibiotics, they're not silver bullets. You know, you're killing a bunch of stuff. And basically what you're trying to do, I mean, it's terrible analogy. It's like chemo with cancer, right? You're trying to kill the target thing and not kill everything else, but you know you're making everything else sick. Stop waving my hands and talk about data. So with Cipro, we use Cipro as an in-tank treatment for brown jelly disease. I use it as a last resort. I'm not recommending this as, you know, what everybody should go out and do today. But a very carefully chosen low dosage, a dosage that I chose because it would kill Archobacter and not other bacteria. Even at that low dosage, we see an impact on the community. We see consistently the ammonia oxidizing microbes go down. Now, if you come in with 10 or 20 times higher dosage, that's a nuclear bomb going off in the microbiome. So, I mean, one point I want to make there is just to consider your dosage. In addition to being hesitant to use them in the first place, consider your dosage. More is not necessarily better. And two, probably whatever dosage you use, there's going to be some kind of impact on the rest of the community. And it would be a great idea to, at the very least, measure it afterwards and make sure you still have kind of an intact community. Ideally, it would be great to do a before and after.
So, Andy, you mentioned ChemiClean and the dangers of potentially hitting a tank repeatedly with ChemiClean to solve, you know, cyano. You recently did that, and did
it once.
You did it once, right? But you also did a pre-post with Eli, and I think you're waiting for one set of the result. That the pre has to be rerun, I think, right? But in terms of the post, share with us what you found with the post.
Yeah, so it took out the cyanobacteria, and I'm gonna when we look at the time series, I'm gonna talk about some of the things that are related maybe to the appearance of the cyanobacteria. But it it wiped out the cyanobacteria, but it wasn't easy on my tank. I mean, I did all the recommended dose. I did everything like they recommend, and I lost a couple frags, and my corals looked very unhappy for a couple days. I lost one of the frags I got from Keith, which made me very sad. But it did work, and I was really sick of having cyano in the sand bed, and so I thought, hey, I've done some other experiments on my tank. I'm going to do a pre and post with Eli's service and see what I can show for other people. What does it do? And so, yeah, we got to wait to see that. I think maybe June 4 is when we get those data back.
Yeah, you know, way to solve that problem is pull a sand bed like I did. Yeah, my cyano has definitely been greatly reduced without the sand bed, but you know, that's it's a very personal choice, right? Some people like the sand beds, other people can live without them. And I lost all my leopard wrasses in that tank, so I was like, all right, you know what? I don't have any leopard wrasses anymore. I can pull the sand bed because I keep messy sand beds as it is, so they're not pretty. And
so, Keith, I was just talking to Steve Wiest, and Steve had an issue with dinoflagellates, and he decided that the dinoflagellates were due to the presence of his sand bed. Now, Steve is very into aesthetics, as you know.
And
right?
he's gonna be a guest on this show coming up.
Yeah, he has to have a sand bed. And so he sucked out 100 pounds of sand to solve the dinoflagellates. But then he went and he bought 80 pounds of live sand from KPI Aquatics and then put it back in.
Nice.
And something happened after that, but
he really wanted to have a sand bed.
And something else happened, but we're gonna broach that topic with him when I have him on. But I know something else went down with that, and I don't want to give it away.
Okay.
So we're definitely going to get to the time series that Annie's been talking about. Another question I thought was worth asking from Alex is that, are there some beneficial bacteria found only on the substrate and others only in the water column? And if so, what species?
Yeah, the nitrifying bacteria are clearly beneficial for water quality, at least, and certainly well studied, well characterized group. These groups are by far much higher abundance in the substrate, the biofilm. Whether you're looking at sand or what we recommend for testing is sort of the inner surface of a pipe. So we find higher levels of those in the biofilm and substrate than in the water column. Importantly, we do find actually quite a high population of ammonia oxidizers in the water column. It's higher in the biofilm in terms of percent community, but think about the sheer volume of the water in your tank. There's quite a high level of ammonia oxidizers in that large volume. So there's actually a good amount of ammonia oxidation going on in the water too. I'm kind of wandering off topic here because that was an interesting and unexpected result. In the water, things that we find in the water, but not the substrate and biofilm, I'm hard pressed to think of beneficial bacteria we find there, but we typically find the pathogens in the water sample rather than the biofilm sample. Now, we know that pathogens are surface associated often, so I don't want to say that they are not associated with surfaces, just that we don't see them in our data, probably because of how we're sampling. I know that if you sample corals directly, we have some clients who will swab a coral directly, and I know that we see coral pathogens at high levels there. So they certainly are associated with some surfaces, but we see lots of them in the water.
So Eli, all right, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that the pathogens would be on the corals themselves, but why are they in the water column? Is that basically their mode of transport to go from one coral to the other, or is that just too simplistic of a reasoning?
So some of these things are actually motile, right, and they can swim. They are not, the coral pathogens are typically not bacterioplankton, that is bacteria that are specialized in free swimming around the ocean, right? But there are bacteria that do that. That's their mode of life. Some of these bacteria that infect corals have be doing limited swimming. But I think the bigger issue that we're seeing here is in an aquarium, there is this incredibly artificial surface area to volume ratio, right? There's a huge amount of surface in an aquarium relative to a pretty small amount of volume if you compare it to the ocean, right? All the water in your aquarium is constantly sloshing back and forth around corals, you know, through the three-dimensional structure of a coral colony, through the pipes. And so there's a large exchange, you know, between the two populations in an aquarium. So I think a lot of what we're seeing here is in the water sample is just that. It's just stuff getting knocked off, you know, into the water.
Gotcha. Bobby Miller has an interesting question. Can the reef-safe Cipro dosage used to treat brown jelly disease 0.125 mgs per liter every 48 hours also possibly treat fish bacterial infections? Do we know the answer to that?
It's a good question. I don't think anybody has tested it on a known fish pathogen. We do have several common fish pathogens that show up in the hobby. Whether they're causing a problem or not, they're in a lot of samples. And I bring that up to say that's a good testing ground to ask that question. So we should have a lot of data on Photobacterium damseli and Vibrio fortis. So I can look at that and ask whether sort of by accident, maybe we've seen some effects on those pathogens. But I don't think none of our clients have talked to me about, you know, using this in that context.
Interesting points here by Intrinsic Reef. Have you discussed the proper disposal of tank water treated with antibiotics? Sending antibiotic-laden water into drains will encourage resistance in human pathogenic bacteria. And then Champion Lighting Supplies says best to bleach your wastewater before dumping down the drain. What do you guys think about that in terms of disposal?
Well, so I mean, the thing about antibiotics is that 40 to 90% of antibiotic activity is still present when they're excreted. Right? So, Keith, if you take an antibiotic, when you pee in the toilet, you take Cipro, it's about 90% active when it goes in the toilet. And then that goes into the sewer. Okay? So all of the human use, right? All those antibiotics go into the sewer and into the public sewer system. Okay? So with that in mind, you know, some water change water that has some antibiotics in it, relative to that is pretty small. So the quinoline antibiotics like Cipro and oxalinic acid, they break down in light. So it's probably broken down somewhat too. However, if you want to feel better about it, you could maybe set your water change water out in the sun or something and get it to break down more. Or I think Champion Lighting Supply suggested adding bleach. I'm not sure what that would do actually, but it seems like setting it out in the sun might help break it down more.
UV.
But you know, antibiotics getting into the sewer system is it's a huge thing with millions of people that take antibiotics and then obviously don't pee into biohazard bags while they're on antibiotics, right? So the contribution of reefers is very, very small to that.
Yeah, all good points. You know, as soon as the question came up, my mind kind of went in a different direction, which is I'm on a septic tank. I know some listeners out there may be on a septic tank. We would never put any salt down our septic tank anyway because of the impact on the microbial community there. So forget about the antibiotics in it. We're not putting the salt down there. Now I guarantee you can get away with a little. So if somebody out there is doing it well, it's probably fine. But our practice is don't put salt down the septic system. So it's a moot point whether there's antibiotics in there. I very much like the philosophy of the question, thinking about, you know, waste disposal. Yeah, I dispose of my salt water on our driveway. Kills the grass, evaporates, and the grass will never grow there now. So I suppose if there's a small antibiotic load in my driveway, I'm not terribly worried about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like the philosophy. Let's think about where our waste goes and think about how to treat it. You know, I think it's a nice suggestion, the idea of using bleach to inactivate it. I know there are some compounds that could be inactivated in that way. I would just have to look at the specific one and ask, what's the effective way to inactivate it? Yeah.
So we've talked a couple of we've had a couple of questions and discussions about coral pathogens being in the water column and what have you, and we haven't talked about the use of UV sterilizers and how that can impact the microbiome. And maybe Eli, this is a good opportunity to look at my microbiome results. Andy, I swear to God, we're going to get to your time series stuff. That is going to be the cherry on top in terms of.
Well, no, this is a good segue, Keith, because then Eli can explain how what the graph shows and stuff.
So Eli, let's look at my data, because the tank that was sampled for the microbiome was I have a UV sterilizer on that, right? And I think it's a typical.
Which sample ID should we look at?
That's a good question. It's the last one that you have from me.
The most recent one, so 1797, I think.
You would know that. Yep, I think the most recent one.
Making sure we're looking at the same thing.
So I'm showing everybody my diversity score, the percentile, and it's low, right? So with a UV sterilizer on the system, does that make sense to you in terms of having that low diversity score?
I can't say that we've seen an effect on diversity. We see such a wide. I know I've tested that question. And I think the answer is we did not find a significant effect. There's a very wide range of diversity scores out there. And so you end up with this situation where there's a wide range without UV sterilizers, and there's a wide range with UV sterilizers, and we can't really tell the difference. Certainly UV sterilizers kill stuff, so it makes sense to think that the diversity of a particular tank could go down from the use of a UV sterilizer, but I can't say there's an overall trend in the data.
So let's look at the community composition. I think that's right, an area where you can kind of see a distinct difference in terms of, all right, this guy's sample, absolutely, he's got a UV sterilizer on there because his composition is different than the typical sample, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we're looking at the same one, I've scrolled down here to your community composition plot, and it looks like it's mainly two groups, right? The sort of purplish Vibrionaceae at the bottom. That's the group that starts with Vibrio, right? And then the orange Rhodobacteriaceae. Are we looking at the same ones?
Yep.
Great. So yeah, those are two of the common groups, but what's missing is this pink group, the Pelagibacteriaceae. And that's the one where it's such a striking effect that when I look at somebody's tank, I know this is either a very new tank, because Pelagibacteriaceae take a while to build up to a dominant level in the community. Either a very new tank or it's a tank running UV sterilizer, because it's such a strong effect. Interestingly, we've also seen that sort of go in both directions, where people turn on the UV sterilizer. So the exact same tank, with or without the UV sterilizer, we see this effect demonstrated.
So let me mention, Eli, that this is a healthy tank. It's an SPS dominant system, and the corals are doing really well in there. So I guess that's always a very debated question in terms of should you be running UV sterilizers on a reef tank. And that's a tough one to answer, I guess.
It really is. I mean, we can see from your tank and from some of our other clients, it is absolutely possible to have a very healthy, thriving tank with a UV sterilizer. I think what our data show is a very clear effect on the microbial community. So if you go that route, you have a reef tank with a fundamentally different microbial community than a natural reef. The Pelagibacteriaceae, if you were to sample on the Great Barrier Reef, a clean offshore face of the Great Barrier Reef, you'd find Pelagibacteriaceae and a couple kinds of cyanobacteria. They'd be the dominant groups there. So if you're running with UV, your microbial community looks fundamentally different. Is that fatal? Clearly not, right? Because your tank's gorgeous. Other clients of ours have beautiful, thriving tanks. However, I would suggest that same tank, if we could magically flip a switch without changing anything else, if we could flip a switch and just increase the abundance of Pelagibacteriaceae in that tank, I think it would only benefit the tank.
Can you do that by dosing, or will the UV knock that out when you're dosing? I mean, unless you take the UV offline for an hour after you dose.
That's the problem. You really got to take the UV out. So the issue with this group
UV out permanently, not just off for an hour.
Oh, sorry. You could turn it off completely, but I think if you turn it back on the next day, you're going to be
knocking them out,
knocking them down.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, I think it's worth experimenting on this point. The effect is so strong that I'm not giving any caveats here. I'm saying absolutely UV kills this group. However, we have seen a handful of tanks where they're running UV and they have a little bit of Pelagibacteriaceae. It's rare. Whenever it comes up, I email them and I'm like, I want to discuss this with you. I suspect there's something different about how UV is plumbed in different people's tanks. Maybe it's as simple as flow rate and wattage. Maybe it's something more complex about the arrangement of the plumbing.
They got to change the bulb.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always my kind of, I don't know, my cynical view is like, yeah, you say you've got UV, but your bulb's dead. I see Pelagibacteriaceae. But I don't know, so all I know is they're telling me they have UV and yet they have a little bit. My point is just to say, maybe there is some regime of turn the UV on for a while, turn it off for a while, but we're in experimentation mode. The safest bet, and what you will absolutely see in effect, is if you turn off the UV and leave it off, you will see Pelagibacteriaceae increase, at least if the nutrient levels are appropriate. If you have super high nutrient levels, these other groups will take over. It's not just driven by what you kill, it's also driven by what you feed. The Pelagibacteriaceae do really well in clean offshore water with almost no nutrients, just a couple of key nutrients that they need.
Given
the other thing, Keith, is that if you run a UV sterilizer, you lose the Pelagibacteriaceae as a marker for tank maturity.
Yeah.
And so when you're setting up a new system, Eli has found that Pelagibacteriaceae doesn't show up right away, and you'll see that in my data. It shows up and it establishes itself when the tank is mature, and so it makes sense, I think, to maybe add the UV sterilizer later if you're using microbiome to measure your tank maturity.
Makes sense. Two more questions, and then we're going to get to Andy's time series. And the first question is from me, and that question is, given that pathogenic bacteria are in the water column, what do you guys, what would you say, does the use of UV increase the likelihood that you will be able to bring down the population of pathogenic bacteria? Will that increase your odds of having an episode with your corals if you're running UV?
Well, it happened to you, Keith, and you have a robust UV system, right? So I guess not enough.
We're not supposed to use me as an example here, but I'm just saying in terms of, obviously it's not a complete fail-safe, or everybody would be running UV and there'd be no STM or RTM. But I guess my question is, yes, it did happen to me. I was running UV, but if would the likelihood of that sort of thing be reduced if you're running UV 24/7?
You're asking whether we expect UV would
knock out pathogenic, some portion of the pathogenic bacteria in the water column.
I've got to say I'm skeptical about it. Okay, so first caveat out of the way, I don't think we have an experiment looking at that. Turn off the UV and see if they go up or down, turn it on and see if they go up or down. But of course, we have lots of data without UV, lots of data with pathogens. And I don't see a trend that tanks that have UV don't have pathogens in them.
Gotcha.
If I were looking only at the data and asking, what do UV sterilizers do? I would conclude they only do one thing, and that is kill Pelagibacteriaceae. I mean, I see...
And diagnose.
And So I don't dispute the observation. I'm only saying I don't see it in the data. Yeah, I mean, we see parasites and pathogens in positive and UV negative tanks. I've run a lot of reef tanks and I've never used a UV sterilizer. I certainly don't believe they're necessary, but I've seen enough beautiful reef tanks with them that I believe they can be part of a thriving reef tank system, right? Yeah, I just keep coming back to that statement that absolutely, if you use UV, you are altering the microbial community. And it's up to all of us to decide, you know, just like we each pick our own alkalinity levels, we might even have disagreements on salinity. We can all pick our Pelagibacteriaceae too, but I'm just saying UV definitely is going to wipe it out.
Yeah.
And your data, you know, support that, of course.
So here's an interesting question from Chris at ACI, and I think I know where he's going with this question, but what are your thoughts on some species in the microbiome need mild exposure to UV to thrive in a closed system? And I think what Chris is getting at is that, you know, I think his observations are that when he's running metal halides, that, you know, versus LEDs, there seems to be more of a likelihood of coral disease under LEDs versus halides because you've got that UV that's being the UVB from the metal halides that perhaps are keeping those pathogens in check.
I mean, I think
that's an easy experiment, Eli.
Sure.
Chris can send you samples from halide tanks and non-halide tanks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that is not something we have in our database, you know, type of lighting. I'm constantly coming up with questions I should have asked. So I can't ask the question from our database. Because we know that UV kills some groups and not others, it therefore makes sense that in the presence of UV, you're going to have an apparent increase in some groups, right? I mean, if your Pelagibacteriaceae goes down, somebody else goes up. And so that can be viewed as a stimulatory effect, whether it's through competition or something more direct. So we could expect that. We also have good reason to expect that there's nutrients that are produced through photooxidation or modified through photooxidation of chemicals in seawater. And so I think that's another very plausible mechanism where UV exposure to the water in your tank can cause photooxidation of nutrients that will then feed bacteria that require those nutrients. I know this is the case for some of the dominant groups in marine aquariums, which is why I kind of go to that possible explanation. So I don't have the specific mechanism like, well, it's going to definitely make this group go up, but I think it's very plausible. It makes sense. And from a competition perspective, maybe even inevitable that UV is also going to promote some groups while it's suppressing other groups.
Gotcha. So, all right, Andy, at the beginning of the live stream, I mentioned that you are a power user of Eli's service. So let's get down and dirty, man, and get into your time series. Let me show slide number 1. Would that be a good one to start with?
Yeah, show slide number 1.
All right, man.
Yeah.
Take us through what we're looking at here.
So I think Eli first told me about his idea for this company over tacos or something for lunch, and I thought it sounded really cool. And he doesn't live very far from me, and he started up this service right around the time that I was setting up this big Red Sea 750 tank, and I saw the opportunity to collect a lot of data and learn something about microbiomes of reef tanks, since before Eli, we knew essentially nothing, right? And so I've been collecting data over the last 45 months, and I've learned a number of things. I think that I've learned, you know, what a good community looks like for my tank. I've learned how to establish that community. And I've learned what things look like when the community goes awry and how to correct it. And so I'm just going to kind of go through basically the time series of the tank and the changes in the microbiome that Eli and I
Well, I can tell right now you're not running UV.
I'm not running UV.
You see how obvious that is? You can see it. Yeah.
That's right. See, Keith is all over that. So anyway, this is 45 months. And so the one thing you see right across most of the samples is that big fat band of Pelagibacteriaceae. And so Eli talked about it before. It is the most common group of bacteria on natural reefs. It thrives in low nutrient conditions. I don't believe we have data that corals consume it, but it is found in basically optimal conditions for coral growth, low nutrients, and so on. And so you can see so I started the tank in 4/1/2019. I started the tank with a mix of dry and live rock. And then 2 months later, we measured the microbiome for the first time. And you can see that it's completely different from the graphs of the rest of the time, right? And Eli, I think, can say that that's typical of a young reef tank. Yeah. Different families can kind of appear in not necessarily a predictable way, but what's predictable is that Pelagibacteriaceae is not. And so Eli glances at that and he says, that's not a mature system. Okay, so let's imagine that I'm cycling a new tank. I send data in. I send a water sample into Eli. How would I use this? Okay, if I want to keep SPS, I want to keep Gonies, more sensitive species, I would get that result back and I would say that's not ready. That is not a mature community. I'm not going to add my more sensitive species to that. And at that time, I had some softies in the tank.
That's a really good point, Andy, because a lot of people are always like wondering, when is the right time to add corals to a reef tank? And I think there's some folks out there that think you could add corals right away. Others don't believe that, but this is kind of great data to have to kind of get that benchmark. I think for SPS, I've always kind of thought like 8 to 9 months. Even if you start a tank with live rock, that's kind of like the marker.
And so, in my experience, even if you start a new system with live rock, there is still, a lot of chaos in the community, a lot of chaos in that community over the first few months. You get all kinds of stuff that happens, and even though I started this tank, it wasn't dry. It was a little bit of dry rock, but it was a lot of live rock from a previous system. Look at the microbiome. Eli, were you going to comment on that?
Yeah,
I'd like to say something.
Just to add the numbers. So, we're sitting here and looking at these pictures, and the three of us have kind of looked at a lot of these pictures together. Right?
Yep.
And it may be challenging for the first-time user to get the picture back and say, well, sort of what should it look like? But I just point out the numbers, the balance scores that you
0.01
there, right? So a super low balance score initially, corresponding to this very odd community, and then a much more typical balance score, right, up to 0.49 when we see
later on
factor start to show up. So yeah, just to say there are some numbers the user could rely on, and it's not just the picture. Right. I think the picture is the most informative way to look at this.
And I don't know, Eli, did you mention the balance score and what it is and how it's calculated, how it can be used?
We've certainly talked about it at some point, and I have lots of links in the report that explain to the user. But basically, it's a number that expresses how normal is the community in your tank. What we're really doing there is comparing your whole community with the typical community of a healthy, established reef tank. That is the average from our large curated database. So we collapse all that down into a number. And if it's a high number, that means your community is very normal. It looks like a typical reef tank. And if it's a low number, it's nothing like a typical reef.
Here's a good question.
So 0.01 is about as low as you can get.
Here's a good question from Eric Recchia. Hopefully I didn't mispronounce that. What data does Andrew have to show that microbial diversity correlates with tank maturity outside of defining maturity by a tank having specific microbial diversity?
It's not diversity. We're not talking about diversity. We're talking about the shape. We're talking about what the graph looks like and how well it compares to Eli's average typical community. Eli, maybe you should explain that a little bit more.
Yes,
so from his database, he has an average typical community of a mature reef tank,
right,
and then he correlates your community distribution with the mature one.
Yeah.
So mine did not correlate at all with an average healthy reef tank in Eli's database.
Yeah, and so it's this metric that we're talking about is about the composition, right? So it's not about counting how many different types, which would be diversity. Instead, it's about asking who, which different types and how much of the different groups. So that's the composition. That's what we're looking at here, these pictures. And it's also reflected in the balance score. So Andy's just discussed how we calculate a balance score. This number ranges from 0 to 1. It's 0 if you're as different as you could possibly be, and it's 1 if you're as similar as you could possibly be. So the higher it is, the more it is like a typical reef tank. Now, I think there was another question kind of buried in that question, and that is sort of addressing some circularity, saying that, well, you're defining it based on the microbiome. How do you know that unless it's the microbiome? I didn't say that well, but I think you know what I'm getting at. What I want to say is we've seen in a couple of experiments. So real experiments where you start a tank or replicated tanks and monitor their microbiome over time. We've seen that the balance score increases over time. And so, I mean, just based on watching the clock, the tank is getting more mature, right? Because it's now 4 months old instead of 0 months old. And we see that the balance. So just making the simple point that we do have direct evidence that as the tank gets more mature chronologically, it also approaches this community that we are calling the mature community.
So Eric wants to clarify that initial question. I think his second question is kind of getting more to the point where he really wants to find out, is there data to show that specific microbiomes actually correlate with better growth / health of SPS?
This is the hardest thing. This is so hard. I mean, it's the field of coral disease research struggles to identify the pathogen, even at the point of speculating and saying it's this one pathogen, let alone fulfilling the postulates and really confirming it's a pathogen. And that's for pathogens, the things that have huge effects on health, right? The things that have subtle effects on health, these are just hard experiments. And I think the answer to your question is I'm unaware of a study that demonstrates outside of heat stress. I can talk about heat stress, but outside of that, in terms of general growth, reproduction, anything like that, I'm unaware of a study that links a specific microbiome state to a specific health condition. Long ago, when I was a coral biologist and studied corals, not bacteria that live on corals, I was quite skeptical of these claims linking microbiomes to apparently everything. In my view, in those days, I was a bit cynical about it. And I was like, come on, you guys are just finding a different microbiome on everything you study and calling that causal, Well, there was a great study that came out, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. I can't cite any details right now, but we can dig it up, where they experimentally demonstrated that the microbial community on the coral itself directly impacts its heat tolerance. And so in that case, it was not about genetics. It was not about history. It was about, do you have the right bugs living on? That's one very specific phenotype, right? Heat tolerance. There's lots of other ones we may care about. I don't have a paper to point to you saying that the right microbiome helps corals grow better, but we have a lot of clients like Andy who observe their tank very closely and observe a particular microbiome state when the tank's doing well and a very different microbiome state when the tank's doing badly.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to. I mean, what we can do is we can collect data on our own system.
Yeah.
And we can recognize when things are doing really well and how the microbiome data correlate with those. There's never going to be a paper written about, reef tank, SPS growth and color, probably. But we can collect a lot of compelling anecdotal data, correlational data on our own systems. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute when my tank is doing the best. So maybe, Keith, do you have another question?
No, why don't you, you want me to bring up slide number 2, or you still?
No, let's just stay on this for now. Okay, and so that was the original, what the original community looked like. And then about 4 months later, and after that, we see the Pelagibacteriaceae band emerge. And the tank was doing great during that time. I introduced my acros and gonies.
Hey, Andy, let me interrupt you. Were you doing any bacteria dosing during that time?
No, I have not dosed any bacteria of any kind. No, never. Although I'll talk about some stuff I'm playing around with purple non-sulfur bacteria in a bit. So anyway, from 1024 to 430, we see the balance score go up, meaning that we're closer to Eli's average healthy community, and the Pelagibacteriaceae band increases, and tank was doing great. All my tank notes at that point say, my acros are having good growth. I've got good color, really no issues to speak of. And then everything went to hell in that I had 2 cases of velvet hit my system, and I had to pull all my fish 2 different times out of the tank and put them into a quarantine system in my garage and try to save them. And so the tank went fallow during that period. And this was very frustrating because my nutrients then really started to go down in my tank. And so both my nitrate and phosphate dropped, and corals started to pale, and I started losing things, and I associated that with low nutrients. This was also sort of peak pandemic, right? And so I was very busy with the extra work stuff, and so I was mostly focused on trying to save all these fish, and I didn't keep as close of a view on my parameters. And so I had started dosing nitrate and phosphate, so trisodium phosphate and sodium nitrate, and to get my nutrients up. And I did that slowly and carefully until I ran out of my phosphate reagent. And then it was during the pandemic, and I couldn't get my hands on any more HANA phosphate reagent. And so I went about 2 months without testing phosphate. And then I come back, and the next time I tested, my phosphate was at 1.0 phosphate, nitrate 1.0. Okay. Now, what I've learned over the years is that everything does better in my system if I keep a ratio of about 100 to 1 nitrate to phosphate. And that's always what I shoot for. And so if nitrate gets too low, I need to dose nitrate. Oftentimes in my systems, nitrate will get low and phosphate will creep up. And when that happens, when phosphate gets higher than nitrate, I tend to have issues with dinoflagellates. And so sure enough, I started to have issues with dinoflagellates. Phosphate hit 1.0. And then right around the same time, I sent in a test to Eli. And phosphate was at 0.8 when I actually collected the data, but they had been higher for about 2 months. All the corals are doing terrible. Acropora is dying. I pulled everything out, all the acros out of the tank, and put them in my frag tank to save them. And take a look at what the microbiome looks like. Pelagibacteriaceae band is gone. Remember, it's a band of bacteria that likes low nutrient conditions. Oceanospirillaaceae shows up, which is a family that thrives on high nutrients. And I think that high phosphate, the nitrate was not high, it was only about 1, but the high phosphate, as far as I can tell, was contributing to that very different microbiome. Eli, what do you think about that microbiome there?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a striking difference, right? It's a night and day difference. It's exactly what I had in mind when we were first talking about these measurements way back when. I was trying to grow corals, and sometimes things go badly in your coral tank, and you just have this sense that there's something there that you're not measuring, right? The nutrients aren't way off, the salinity's right, and here it is. I mean, just such a clear example of there's the something.
Well, in this case, phosphate was high.
Sure. Yeah.
I just
in your case,
hadn't been measuring it.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's just, I mean, you don't have to be an expert to know those two different, right? That's
right. And so I did a bunch of water changes. I added GFO and I brought things down. And then at this point I added my fish had all passed quarantine, added the fish back to the system, and the nutrients stabilized at my 100-to-1 ratio that I like, about nitrate at about 15, phosphate about 0.05 to 0.15, within that range. And this is the period of about a year then that I like to think of as sort of the golden age of my tank. It was amazing. Right around this time, Keith, I don't know if you remember, I sent you a picture of these Oregon tort frags that over 10 months quadrupled in size. I went from little Oregon tort frags that grew into large colonies in 10 months. I had tremendous growth in color over this about a year period of time. And if you look at the microbiome during this time, basically my balance scores were 90% and above. One of them was like 98th percentile, wow. Meaning that it was almost an exact copy of Eli's average community. And this is the community that I learned that I want to aspire to if I'm measuring a microbiome in my tank. Again, all through this, I measure alkalinity, I measure phosphate, nitrate, all the regular parameters. And those have been, with the one exception of phosphate, those have been stable throughout this time. But it's the microbiome that really reflected another parameter that I now recognize as being associated with coral growth and health. And so, yeah, that was great.
That was the golden age of the tank,
yeah.
Huh?
Go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to say, that's the golden age of the tank there, huh?
The golden age, exactly. And now Eli and I think that we start to see some signs of old tank syndrome, or things that we would ascribe to old tank syndrome. It's a 4-year-old system, so it's not that old, but it's got a sand bed, and it seems to be shifting in a different direction, okay? Again, these are things that you can see in the microbiome test, but not necessarily what you would see just by measuring nitrate and phosphate and alkalinity, okay? So right around, 418, okay, a little bit later, I started to have brown jelly on my gonies. And it was spreading throughout. I had about 30 goni colonies in the tank, and they would retract their polyps, and they would develop kind of a weird film on them, and then the tissue would just kind of disintegrate. If it got in the flow, the tissue would just kind of disintegrate. It would just, it was very, very fast tissue necrosis. And right around that time, then I tested the water. And then I got a swab kit from Eli. And so we swabbed a goni that had brown jelly on it, and we swabbed a control goni that was healthy from the same tank. We identified Arcobacter in the water, and we identified Arcobacter in the brown jelly, and not in the negative control. And so, as I alluded to earlier, that was the first evidence that Arcobacter is linked to brown jelly disease in gonis, as well as euphilia, which is what Eli showed earlier. And so when I got that data back, then I decided to treat the tank with Cipro, and I used Eli's low dose treatment. I also took the remaining gonis. I lost half of my collection. I had about 15 left, and I did dips in Cipro then every 2 days, 3 times. And that wiped it out. That took it right out. The brown jelly disease went away. And I had another 6 months of, really, really good conditions. Now you can look, if you look at the, can you see that in this view of the figure, Eli, and Keith, the difference in the community between when there was a brown jelly outbreak and after the Cipro treatment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it looks like you
see how the pink band gets a lot bigger,
yeah,
and how the orange band gets smaller.
Yeah, that's right.
When the Cipro treatment is applied, the balance score goes up. So basically, I had this disrupted community with brown jelly,
Right.
After we treated with Cipro, a month later, the community looked much more similar to the community during the golden age of the tank.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just add that we had those same conclusions in my tank experiments with this too. So that is increase in balance score and increase in Pelagibacteriaceae.
Yep. So around the same time, right around when the brown jelly happened, I started to get some persistent cyano on my sand bed. And Keith, I mentioned this to you before. I know you dealt with some of this too. I started to get cyano. And normally I haven't had, it's not something I've had trouble with in my systems in the past. And this cyano on the sand bed that I just couldn't get rid of. Around the same time, then, you can see that the orange band, the Rhodobacteriaceae, is becoming a larger component of the community. So there's a shift from the golden age of the tank, where it's a relatively small proportion, to later on where it's a larger proportion of the community. Okay. And then I had an interesting thing happen that maybe by sharing this story will help some people. So I didn't know this, but if you dose nitrate to your tank, when the nitrate is consumed, it serves as a secondary source of alkalinity in your system. So what happens is that when ammonia is converted to nitrate in your tank, it consumes alkalinity. When the nitrate is reduced, then the alkalinity is released back into the system. So if the ammonia is generated in the tank and it all happens in the tank, then there's no net loss or gain. But if you add nitrate from the outside into your tank, it releases alkalinity. And so I saw my alkalinity going up as I was increasing my nitrate dosing. And I thought, oh, okay, I need to turn down my 2-part dosing, because I use ATI elements 1 and 2. Element 2 is calcium. So I turned them both down equally, because that's how I've always done it for the last 7 years. And that resulted in my calcium getting lower and lower and lower and lower as my alkalinity, even though my alkalinity was stable. Okay. And so then I started to have some, bad things happen in the tank, and I noticed something was wrong. Everything started to look bad. And then I tested my calcium, and my calcium was about 320 and had been so likely for a month or more. And because of me not knowing that I was increasing my alkalinity with a nitrate dosing. And so what that resulted in is an STN and RTN outbreak in my acros. And this was around the time that you had Chris Meckley on, I think, Keith, and you talked about how you used oxalic acid as a treatment in your tank. And I thought, hey, that sounds like a exactly timely thing for me to try out in my tank because of what I'm dealing with, because I have all this STN issues with my acros. And so I tried it out, and you can see my pre and post data there, where look at my pre data. Look at that profile. There's not even any Pelagibacteriaceae in there at all. It's almost all Rhodobacteriaceae. Again, Rhodobacteriaceae are the detritus bacteria that the SETLD bacteria are part of, the Shimia and so on, okay? Just completely dominating that community. At the same time then, Eli and I did the same swab test with a milli. So we did a milli that was RTNing and a milli that was not, as a negative control. And we found Arcobacter in the material that was on the RTNing milli, not on the healthy milli, and also in the water. And so that was the first evidence then that Arcobacter is linked to tissue necrosis in Acropora, which was an interesting find. It was associated with death of acros in my tank. And so you can see the impact of the treatment of the oxalic acid. The last graph there, the pink band comes back. That's the Pelagibacteriaceae band coming back, and the Rhodobacteriaceae band shrinks. Okay, and the balance score went up quite a bit. And so those were the results of that treatment. But neither of those treatments touched the cyanobacteria. So I still am dealing with this issue with cyanobacteria, even though everything else is doing relatively well.
That's the bane of
all through this time, You know, nitrate and phosphate aren't changing. Nothing is changing except what I'm measuring with my AquaBiomics tests, right? And Eli thinks, we talk about this, Eli thinks that, hey, this Rhodobacteriaceae shift indicates that you've got accumulation of nutrients in your sand bed. You're seeing signs of old tank syndrome. There might be a lot of dissolved organic carbon, dissolved nitrate and things in your system. And so I sent the Triton NDOC test. You know, have you heard of the NDOC test, Keith?
I have not.
You done?
No, I haven't.
So it measures dissolved nitrogen, carbon, and phosphate and phosphorus in your tank, things that you can't measure with your normal test kits. And sure enough, I got my Triton results back, and I have really high levels of dissolved organic carbon in the tank.
Oh, cool.
And nitrogen.
I want to address some comments by John Wright, and you know, these are fair comments. You know, one of the comments is, this is like Formula One racing compared with loving the car we drive. How many hobbyists will delve into this stuff this far? And I mean, listen, I'm the first one to admit that you know, when I first started reef keeping, I consider myself an old school reef keeper. So I am not one to dig into the minutia of a lot of data and act on that data all the time. You know, that so I think that's my philosophy these days, is that if this is information, right? And it's we're information. We're in a very information gathering type of hobby. There's a lot of new information out there, like Eli's service. There's ICP testing, where you've got all these different elements. You know, when I get ICP tests, am I acting on you know, a deficient or a you know, a element that's way too high? You know, maybe I'll wait a couple of months or different tests before I act on that data. So I think it's great to have the information. I think that you can't overreact to the information, but in terms of the AquaBiomics data and digging into the different types of bacteria that you have in your system, yeah, that can be a very complex thing to try to figure out in terms of how to. What was that?
Sorry.
That wasn't me, but. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I understand the comment that too much information can be a bad thing, but I also think that you don't have to act on that information. It's good intelligence to gather, to have. And if you have a case where you've got a lot of RTN and STN and you do an AquaBiomics test and it shows that you've got coral pathogens, then, you know, hey, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that maybe you need to do something about that based on that information. But if you've got certain ratios of the, you know, the pink band is much greater on the normative database versus what you have in your tank, you know, I don't know, guys, what do you think about that? I'm kind of rambling here.
So just a couple things.
Yeah, go ahead.
So first thing, I have a Ph.D. in zoology. Okay, this is what I do. I collect data like this.
Right.
I'm also a science educator. I want to learn something from my tank. I want to help others. I want to learn something about what an optimal community looks like, how it changes over time, and what we can do about it. I don't assume that everybody is going to collect data like I am on their tank. What I'm doing is I'm trying to explain how I'm learning things about the shift that I can help other reefers with. And I'm not reacting quickly, right? So this shift is over a year, right? This shift to the Rhodobacteriaceae is happening over a year. It's leading up to what I'll talk about in a minute, some things that I'm going to do. So sorry, go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a fair criticism. Frankly, the three of us are kind of reef keeping geeks, aren't we? I mean, maybe not everybody who just wants Nemo in their living room is going to spend as much time on water chemistry as you know, people in this audience do. But there are a lot of very simple questions we can ask with these tests. I think you don't have to be going down the very, very deep reef ecology world to make use of this. A couple of simple questions. One, do I have a normal microbial community or a completely weird microbial community? this is actually a pretty relevant question. I mean, something went wrong in my tank, and I want to know, was this caused by like chemistry or temperature or lighting or overfeeding, or, you know, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Well, this is an invisible thing that could be going wrong in your tank that you can ask that simple question. Is it normal or is it completely weird? 2, presence or absence of a pathogen. Keith, I think you mentioned this. Like, this is not too far down the rabbit hole, right? You found a pathogen or you did not find a pathogen. That's a pretty clear course. Well, there are options in both cases, but it's a pretty clearly actionable piece of information that you can do something with. So, I mean, I think the technology can do really cool things like what you guys are doing with these replicated oxalinic acid experiments. But I think reef keepers who do that are not the only ones who could benefit from the service. Perhaps other reef keepers might want to take just once a year. Take once a year and just see how is the reef tank doing.
And you know, every test that's done in the reef keeping community is going to help other reef keepers, because then you're collecting normative data. You're collecting data, and the more data that gets collected, the more actionable, reliable that data can be. So even if you don't act on the data that you're getting from Eli service or ICP tests or what have you, it's just more data out there that's being aggregated. And there could be something, you know, we could potentially learn from that stuff. So I think that's
absolutely. And a great case in point is the one we've spent so much time talking about today, the Pelagibacteriaceae. I don't run any UV tanks. I haven't done any experiments with UV. So if it was just me doing this stuff, we would still not know that this group was so strongly impacted by UV. But because you all are doing these experiments, by some of you running a tank one way and some another way, that came into the database, and now that's information that I send back out to every client. You know, if you come back with a low Pelagibacteriaceae level, I'm going to feed you that information that we've learned from the other clients. So just saying that it's a tangible example of exactly what you're talking about, Keith, that we learned from all of your experiments.
Yep. We got a couple more questions in the chat, but Andy, I don't want to like derail your.
Well, let me excuse me. Let me just say one thing, and then we can go to the questions. So, what to do about this shift? That looks like it's potentially a sign of old tank syndrome. So, my Triton NDOC test suggested that I do massive water changes to reduce the dissolved organic carbon. Okay. My philosophy has been to not rely on those kinds of things as much as I can, because I see the future of reef keeping as not having access to lots of cheap water, especially out west, right? We're going through lots of issues with water availability. And so I want to see if I can shift the balance back to where it was in the golden age by using some probiotics. And so someone in our local forum, the Pacific Northwest Marine Aquarium Society, has been keeping several cultures of purple non-sulfur bacteria. And many of you have probably heard of this, because these are also sold by Hydrospace LLC, right? And they're very versatile microbes that they're used in shrimp farming in Thailand as a way to break down detritus and as a way to feed larval invertebrates. And so, this friend of mine from our forum has been using these bacteria to reduce detritus and phosphate and nitrate in several tanks. And he gave me some cultures, and I'm gonna try it. I've started dosing already, and I'm gonna see, you know, is there some way that I can deal with this from the microbial side of things before I do massive water changes and pull the Steve Wiest and remove my sand bed.
And a ReefBum who did that as well.
So
go ahead, Eli.
Andy, I didn't remember that you had gotten those Triton results back, these DIC results. That's really cool. I was just reviewing, there is good data showing that coral reef Rhodobacteriaceae, the specific ones that live on coral reefs, are enriched, or they're associated with higher DIC and DOC levels in nature. So just to say that exactly the same group we're talking about is associated with high DOC on coral reefs. And you've just told me you have high DOC in your tank. So all of this is coming together to say it really does look like
three times the recommended high range value according to Triton.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is really coming to say together to say it is a nutrient mediated shift in your microbiome,
and not measurable with normal tests, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. Yeah. It's a new parameter.
Right. It's not nitrate levels creeping up over time.
You guys are blowing my mind. So Champion Lighting and Supply has a question that the three of us were talking about before the live stream, and that's when Paletta was on the show recently, he mentioned getting Arcobacter, which he believed came from frozen food. Has any testing been done on foods as a source of bacteria? So is that possible? Can bad bacteria come in via frozen food?
Right. So bacteria definitely, bacterial genetic material, bacterial DNA definitely comes through in frozen foods of various types. I don't have any specific data, but there's lots of literature on Vibrio in brine shrimp preparations. The question, of course, is, are they viable, right? So is it a viable bacterium that's made it through in that frozen piece of food and then it thaws in your tank and grows? I read some evidence that some Arcobacter can live up to a week in freezing conditions. You know, freeze them in a block of ice, put them in the freezer for a week. Some of them will survive. This is for some types of Arcobacter. I'm not sure if they're even closely related. Point is to say that theoretically, I can imagine a bacterium coming through in the food source. I am skeptical that they can make it through in enough numbers and viable enough to establish a population. But that's a hand-waving skepticism. I think what we need to do is exactly what the listener that asked the question suggested. That is, let's test the food. So we find dozens of different types of Arcobacter in aquarium samples. These are defined by their different DNA sequences. So if you come back and tell me, well, I have this Arcobacter sequence in my food and I have this different Arcobacter sequence in my tank, it didn't come there from your food, right? It's a clear diagnosis that we can do. So I think that should be the next step to answer that question. Yeah.
Preventative measure, until we learn more about that, would putting frozen food in a microwave potentially help prevent that from happening? Bringing in Arcobacter?
I mean, yeah, you know, high temperatures do a good job at killing bacteria. There's always the weird ones that can survive unusually high temperatures. We use autoclaves in a research context for this, which is like a pressure cooker. I mean, it's out of the reach of what a hobbyist is going to want to do. Boiling is not a bad idea. I mean, I'll tell you, I've used that in a lot of contexts for sterilizing media when it doesn't have to be perfectly sterile. Yeah, boiling is a reasonable strategy. I'm going to say I'm pretty skeptical this is the source of a lot of disease in the hobby, but let's collect some data and prove me wrong. It's certainly possible.
Seems to me there's a lot of other things that are a lot more likely.
Yeah. That makes sense.
There's a lot of other things you're putting in your tank that we know have bacteria in them, like corals and fish and snails.
Yep. Here's a good question from Clearwater Scrubbers. Have you done testing to determine if the bacteria change depending on the filtration used in the tank, i.e. refugium versus traditional macros versus algae scrubbers versus carbon dosing versus mechanical filtration? So can the type of nutrient export that you do impact the microbiome?
Yeah, I've looked at some of those questions, not recently, but you know, our database grows over time, and in theory, every day I could answer questions that I couldn't answer yesterday, but I don't actually look at it every day, right? At one point, I went through and asked some of those questions. We did see some associations with macroalgal refugium. I believe the Flavobacteriaceae were increased in those groups, in those tanks. A lot of the other filtration types that you're talking about there, unfortunately, I don't have the information. You know, I only ask a certain set of questions to our clients, just to keep the questionnaire short enough. And so I haven't asked them about every single item on that list. Mechanical filtration, that's one that I haven't addressed. I suspect that filter socks have a big impact. I know there's a wide range. Some people don't do socks. Some people always use socks. I suspect that has a big impact, and I don't have the data on that either. Same
Depends
reason.
how often you change them, Eli.
That's,
if you have
yeah,
socks, just let them build up stuff in them and get dirty and dirty and dirty. Then it's probably different than if you change them every week, like Keith does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Twice a week now. Well, the higher micron socks get clogged up on me now. So yeah, I gotta change them out like every few days. Amanda Meckler has a funny comment. How many studies can be done from this conversation alone? ? Endless laugh out loud. Yeah, there are.
Yeah, I miss my days in the university when I could grab a few undergraduates who are interested and say, "Hey, do an experiment, write up on some little thing." You know, now I have just me, so we have these conversations, and then I say, "Well, I don't have time to do all those experiments or write up all those studies." Yeah.
So guys, we're pushing 2 hours here on the stream. Did we miss anything? I know there's so much to cover and so many questions that people have, and I know that Eli, they could certainly reach out to you if they have any questions
Absolutely.
about their services. And Andy, what's the best way if people have any questions for you to get a hold of you? You're on social media, right?
Yeah, they can. Excuse me. They can either find me on Humblefish, or they can find me on Facebook, or at the PNW MAS is our local forum. I'll put in a plug for our local forum. Support your local reef club. So our club is the Pacific Northwest Marine Aquarium Society. We're fortunate in the greater Portland area to have a really great group of hobbyists. I'm going to be the president of it this coming year.
Cool.
Congratulations.
And, so you can also find me on the PNW MAS forum. Cool.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, guys. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us, and would love to have you guys back on to continue the conversation.
We can talk about the ChemiClean results then.
Yes, absolutely.
That's right. Let's finish that experiment.
Yeah.
Back for that. That sounds great.
All right, guys. Well, listen, thanks again so much. And I also want to thank the sponsors of the live stream, Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine, for sponsoring the show and supporting the show. And also want to thank all you folks out there for tuning in. And I also want to give a big thank you to Paul, who is the moderator, as well as the president of the Boston Reefer Society. Andy, you beat me to it, but please join and support your local reefing clubs. They are so important to this hobby. I also want to let you folks know that all episodes of Rappin With ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. My next Rappin With ReefBum live stream will be next week, but it's going to be Tuesday, not Thursday. It's going to be Tuesday. Time, day change, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Greg Carroll. Had him on a few times, so that'll be another great show. If you want to check out the full upcoming schedule of guests, please visit reefbum.com under the YouTube section. So until next time, be safe and be well, and later.